Hello, I'm Richard Chambers, Senior Advisor, Risk and Audit for Audit Board, and welcome to another in my continuing podcast series, Speaking of Risk and Audit. I'm joined today by Mike Levy, CEO of Cherry Hill Advisory and former VP of Internal Audit at Student Transportation of America. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Richard. Excited to be here.
Mike and I have known each other for a long time. We worked together back at the IIA. We were on the board together, and it's always great to catch up with old friends. You know, Mike, congratulations on recently completing your term on both the II Global and North American boards. Can you share with our listeners a little about Cherry Hill Advisory and what's next for you at the IIA?
Thanks, Richard. I appreciate it. And it feels like just yesterday we were sitting in the North American board meetings together. It's been a long time. I've been on the board since I believe it's 2018, and I can honestly say one of the most fulfilling experiences of my professional career. Meeting some of the most talented practitioners and passionate practitioners in our industry, and it's been one of the best things I've done. And you really can see the tangible change in our profession from some of the decisions that happen as part of what the IAA and the boards are doing. And it's I think back very nostalgically over all the time and all the different board members I've had the opportunity to work with. As you mentioned, I was a chief audit executive for the better part of a decade and had always missed the consulting world. So Cherry Hill Advisory is a global risk advisory practice really focused on emerging risk topics as well as quality within internal audit functions. So we treat things a little bit different than some of the other firms that are out there. And we're working with chief audit executives and their teams around some of the topics that they have the most trouble dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Everything from cyber risk, regulatory, we're doing a lot around AI governance, focused on quality assessment with the new global internal audit standards that we'll talk about throughout some of today, I'm sure. And it's really been a really impactful and rewarding experience. We're getting to solve a lot of challenges and help internal audit functions really excel and achieve the results that they want to do. From an IA perspective, I've always been a really active and engaged volunteer, and it's something that I'm really passionate about. And just because my time on the boards has concluded, I'll be moving to the standards board in July. So I'm really excited about that, because our standards are really the cornerstone of what we do in this profession, and to be able to leave a mark on that and continue to contribute there is something I've always been interested in. So it's something I'm looking forward to in the future.
Mike, drawing on Cherry Hill's recent engagements, I'd be interested in your perspectives on any emerging risks or pain points that you're seeing that are keeping CAEs awake at night.
One of the favorite parts of my role has really been around the interactions I get to have with CAEs and how we get to bounce different ideas off of one another. And I would say the biggest questions I'm getting, and there's a root cause to some of this, but it is really focused on cyber and AI. I'm seeing it nearly every risk assessment, and I honestly can't even think of one that hasn't had this. But cyber is a top 5 risk, and usually the number 1 or number 2 on a risk assessment. And I'm finding that CAEs are trying to continue to evolve their approach as the second line and even operations teams have gotten a lot more mature in their process and the mappings. And I'm seeing a lot of questions come in on that. And then AI specifically, both how internal audit functions can adopt and utilize it to the best of their ability, but also what do we do in a company that wants to mature into AI and they're trying to formulate governance process and control, and how do we audit that as practitioners? And Richard, you've always talked about being a trusted advisor and what that looks like within an organization. And this, to me, this is like one of the best opportunities to do that, because everybody's learning all at the same time. It's evolving and changing. The regulatory landscape's evolving, and for us as practitioners, this is an opportunity for us to showcase and demonstrate how we can be agile and nimble, how we can work with them on something that's maybe not mature enough always to do full-blown assurance. And these are the biggest things I'm getting asked. We're seeing more questions coming in globally, frankly, on some of the regulatory concerns and issues given the changing political landscape across North America. We're seeing topically, if I take a step back and look at everything that's coming, in the profession, we're seeing a talent shortage, and both from new new professionals coming in all the way through seasoned practitioners, recruitment and retention continues to be really challenging. And frankly, the most common thing I when I get a question about cyber or AI or other, it's really, we don't feel that we have the subject matter expertise on our team. Can you help us with that? Or we just had somebody and they left us for another company. So CAEs are still actively grappling with making sure they have the right people in the right places at the right time.
Yeah, I had a lot of conversation recently, and survey and analysis has indicated that internal auditors, a lot of CAEs in particular, are somewhat apprehensive about diving too deep into AI because they don't really understand it. In fact, I think it was over 60% of the respondents to an audit board survey last fall said, the reason we're not doing more with AI is that we don't really fully understand it. Are you finding that's changing? Because obviously this is emerging at warp speed, the use of AI, the proliferation. Are you finding that maybe even over the last 6 months, you're seeing internal audit functions becoming more comfortable with using AI?
I don't know comfortable if I would say that, but I think people are being forced into it in some way, shape, or form at the end of the day. And I think, any opportunity that we have to educate on this topic, we certainly are, especially internal to the function, because what I have very commonly seen with CAEs is, my experience is very similar to what you just articulated, in that there's some apprehension when we don't understand something. How do we implement it properly? And the thing I talk to most of our practitioners about is start small. And I think it doesn't have to be a full blown major product implementation where you're developing your own internal large language model. There are ways that you can securely, obviously I always have to be careful with data security and privacy in this world, but there are ways that you can very easily and practically implement very simple use cases. And frankly, audit board's a great example of it. A lot of third party platforms that our practitioners are using are starting to develop and implement really sophisticated AI tool sets that, even if you don't, at the end of the day, even if a practitioner doesn't implement it themselves in a way that is specific to their organization, AI is coming one way or another, even if it's just through the applications that we're all using.
Mike, you've been helping a lot of internal audit functions prepare for the external quality assessments, those assessments that have to be done at least every 5 years. And you're helping them prepare for maybe the first assessment under the new standards. Could you walk us through a real client scenario that shows the sort of the return on investment of getting an assessment ready early?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm seeing two different types of functions out there as it relates to compliance, and one is someone that wants to check the box and just say I comply, and yes, we we certainly do those types of projects. However, to me, when I take a step back and I think about the purpose of our standards and why quality assessment and why you want to make sure you're successful at it, it's all about articulating your value proposition to your organization. And I think that the new global internal audit standards are a huge opportunity for us as professionals to showcase and highlight what we do best within our organizations, and why we're important, and why we should have a seat at the table, and why our executive teams and our audit committees and our boards should rely on us. And one of the things we are very focused on when we undertake new assessments and engagements is we have a fairly sophisticated way that we think about quality assessment, from the gap assessment all the way through a formal EQA opinion. But one of the things for us in everything that we do, and one of the things I think makes our firm really different, is that we're really focused on the value drivers within an internal audit function, and beyond just compliance, making sure that what we are presenting and what we are reviewing helps a chief audit executive really think holistically and strategically about their function and the things that they can be doing beyond the compliance checkboxes to really drive and articulate value. And if you look at the standards and you look at the changes that have happened, so from 2017 to the new global internal audit standards, a lot of the things that are in there, if you take a step back and you focus and you treat it like a sales opportunity within your organization, it's really focused on making sure executive management, your audit committee, understands how and what internal audit is. It talks about advisory services engagement. There's focus on internal audit strategy and charter updates. And if you yes, you can just check the box and comply with these activities. But if you really operationalize some of that within your organization, I really do believe it creates an opportunity to deliver and share the value of internal audit. So we're really focused on that when we work with CAEs. And I think to answer your original question, I think that's really what the real value and the ROI, that I think CAEs can get out of complying early.
I think last year was for a lot of audit functions, internal audit functions, the get ready year for the new standards. Now they're suddenly finding themselves in a sort of a follow-on get ready year for the new cybersecurity topical requirement standard, right? So a lot of CAEs are really scrambling to figure out what that's about. In terms of your own gap assessments that you're running, where are internal audit functions commonly missing the mark, and how do you think they can close those gaps quickly when it comes to that particular standard?
That's a great point. So the topical requirements, to your point, I think are the probably the biggest change to our new global internal audit standards. And I think on the surface level, if you look at them, there was a lot of commentary and discussion, and the exposure period, I think, highlighted a lot of concern that individuals had. But I am a believer that the final release really addressed many of those concerns, and I think it's a practical topical requirement and augmentation of the standards that really delivers value if implemented correctly. When I talk to CAEs and through some of the assessments we've done, what I'm seeing in a practical sense is that most internal audit functions have the core of what they need to comply with the topical requirements. Because at the end of the day, a cybersecurity topical requirement is not meant to replace a cybersecurity framework within an organization. In that, if you're using NIST or CIS or some of these really sophisticated or ISO, these really sophisticated frameworks, it's not meant to replace it. It's really just to make sure that there is some level of uniformity and consistency if we are auditing a topic within a function. And when you think about the vast demographic changes we have between an internal audit function that's publicly traded versus private versus small versus large versus a North American organization versus a European one, no two audit functions are the same. And when we think about advocacy and we think about articulating our value proposition, having some consistency is really important. Going back to what your question, when I think about the biggest challenges that practitioners have is that they are doing a lot of the things that the topical requirements talk about. They are not necessarily documenting them in a way that is meaningful for an EQA. And that's where the rubber meets the road, in my opinion, from a quality assessment and conformance to the standards, is that if you're doing them, and that's great, I think that's a huge step in the right direction, but without the proper, we're auditors at heart, right? So without the proper documentation, it's really difficult sometimes to evidence some of that. So one of the things I've always recommend, whether we are in the process with a client or we're just interacting on a from a practitioner level, is that taking those standards, the document's 2.5 pages long of the actual standard, and making sure that you've addressed them anytime you are touching cyber, and then making sure it's documented. Because if it's not documented and you can't evidence it, it does create a conformance issue as it relates to the new standards. They talk about governance, they talk about risk assessment, they talk about internal control. It's all topics we know really well as practitioners. So it's really just a matter of making sure you've gone through your process and your steps to properly augment and segment. And when I look at it, the one tip I would give everybody listening is that if you evaluate cybersecurity as part of another audit, even if it's not a cyber focused audit, I always use like a very simple accounts payable process where you're looking at segregation of duties or some very rudimentary piece of cyber, that the cyber topical requirement does come into play. However, it doesn't mean you have to evaluate the full topical requirement every single time. If you have holistically addressed governance across your whole organization through an audit, you don't have to necessarily do it again. It's just a matter of making sure it's properly documented.
Yeah. Well, I do know that there has been some apprehension out there around topical requirements, and it's reassuring to know that you're going to be joining the standards board along with a number of other colleagues that I know, and I know you guys will be very attuned and very conscientious in listening to the feedback you get. The cyber risk landscape morphs almost daily, from identity-based attacks to now deep fake frauds. How should internal audit rethink its risk assessment cadence so it stays relevant rather than reactive to these kinds of threats?
Yeah, I mean, I still see a lot of internal audit functions with point in time risk assessments. The internal audit landscape is shifting, and you look at things like IA's Vision 2035 and how we think about our profession. You're seeing a convergence of the second and third line in a lot of cases, and it's mixed. But you see a lot of internal auditors that have oversight for the ERM process within their function, which I think we could probably do a whole podcast just on that topic alone. However, I think when we think about risk assessment, whether you have oversight of ERM or you're just providing input into an ERM function, doing a risk assessment at a point in time and only once per year or once every couple of years, I don't think is enough with how this, especially in some areas like this, how quickly things are shifting and changing. And I think you will find if you go to the proper level of depth in these areas, to your point, deep fake fraud was a few years ago was not, it may, I mean, maybe it existed, and is it just another form of social engineering attacks, and making sure you have the right preventive measures in place is critically important. I also think with the augmented AI, there's a whole new holistic lens of attack vectors that exist. And taking a step back, we have always talked about, as it relates to cyber risk, it's not just about the prevention, it's about the detection, it's about how to be resilient and recover afterwards. And I think the ways you do that effectively and efficiently are changing dramatically as technology improves and advances, as the attack vectors change. And I think, to your point, from a practitioner perspective, if we're looking at that once a year, we're just doing basic IT general control security reviews or segregation of duty reviews, or just auditing things that exist in the organization, rather than taking that step back and looking at the full risk landscape and saying what controls are missing and where are our gaps that we as a company need to evaluate. I think we are missing the mark. And I think there's a huge opportunity for us to deliver value within the profession and be more proactive.
Mike, I've been doing my annual assessment at the end of every year of what are the top strategic risks that chief audit executives think they're facing. And for the last 3 years, that the number one strategic risk was really around talent, being able to recruit and retain the talent that they need to be able to execute the internal audit mission. And I don't think they were talking about just finding arms and legs. I think they're really talking about being able to find the expertise to address the key risks facing the organization. And certainly technology, IT risks are at the top of that pyramid. So what advice do you offer? What strategies do you see working for CAEs who struggle to get the IT talent to address those IT risks? Is it just continuing to beat the pavement to hire somebody, or are you seeing strategies where there's third party sourcing? How does that play out?
This is the area we get the most questions about, and I think a co-sourcing model helps a whole lot here to make sure you have the right augmentation on your team. However, the other thing we tend to be very focused on when we come in is there's always a training and upskilling element to this too. So I think what we often see from a talent shortage perspective is two things. One, finding the talent's hard enough, but then making sure you have the budget to retain and keep them and even hire them in the first place also becomes a really difficult part. So when we come in, what we very often do is we will help manage and execute pieces of the more strategic and emerging risk topics, but we also spend a lot of time on training and education and focus on how do we upskill the team and the talent that exists today. So that's one area I have seen CAEs be really effective at, is taking someone that they think is a high performer and has the right requisite skill set, and then shaping them into those practitioners. That's still not an ultimate replacement for all of the deep technical expertise. And candidly, that's why we get phone calls on those areas. But one thing that I do believe makes us different is we're really focused on some of those training aspects, because the landscape is changing, and it's a full-time job just staying on top of some of the changes and making sure you understand the new technologies. And that's where the strategic, to your point on some of the strategic risks and ultimately the strategic recommendations we can and should be making to our organizations. If you don't have all of that deep knowledge, it's hard to be practical. You could say something's not working, but then how do you fix it? And being part of the recommending of the solutions is a key part of how we deliver our value.
Going back to AI, And this is a question I usually wrap up the podcast with my guests lately, and that is, what do you think is the biggest promise of AI, particularly for our profession? And what do you think is the biggest threat that AI presents to internal audit?
I actually think it's one and the same. I think the biggest promise is the biggest threat. And that's as we see, even if you take the tool that most people know most prevalently in this space, which is the open AI ChatGPT sort of models where you're going out to these tools, you ask them a question and they give you a response. There's a whole host of other things around agentic AI and automating a lot of process through that. But even if you take the most basic, I think a lot of the mundane clerical tasks that we are performing, even in the models that exist today, can be in a really thorough way augmented. So imagine the very simple use cases, the documentation of observations and recommendations. I think AI can do a really good job of helping you structure and format those things where we were taking hours and hours, it can do it in minutes as long as you can identify it. That also creates a really significant risk because as a seasoned practitioner, when we ask AI a question and it gives us a response, we have the requisite skill set to know whether that response is valid and what changes need to be made in that response. And it can be a huge accelerator because it saves you the time from some of the mechanical steps of that, but you're still using your subject matter expertise and skill set to make sure that the end result provides the output you need. Where I think that's a challenge is if you think about how we got to the point we are in our career to become a subject matter expert in some of these areas, there's a lot of learning and there's a lot of trial and error and there's a lot of figuring out. And when you take a less earlier in career generation of practitioners that are also using AI, they don't have all of that foundational knowledge and they haven't developed it over years. And the unfortunate truth is there's a lot of opportunity and risk that gets created when they leverage AI and blindly rely on it that can actually damage the value proposition of internal audit within organizations. So, to me, I think there's a huge time saver, and I think every CAE I talk to does not feel that they have all of their risk coverage that they need and the resourcing to address all of the risks that they have, and they all, if given the opportunity, would increase budgets and scope across the organization. So I think AI helps tremendously with that to address more and a wider landscape and do it in a continuous way. However, I think we need to be very cognizant of the training and educational programs for earlier career professionals because leveraging AI without the right controls in place, whether it's internal to the department or external to the organization, creates a really significant risk that we have to understand and manage.
Great. Great insights, my friend. It's been good to catch up. I want to thank you for joining the podcast, and I'd like to thank our listeners for joining us on another episode of Speaking of Risk and Audit.
Thanks, Richard. It was a pleasure being here today and looking forward to talking to you soon.